Hello, my name is Daniel. Thank you for being here with me today. If you enjoy real, heartbreaking cheating stories from Reddit, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. It really means a lot to me. This is a story that's been haunting me ever since I read it. It's about love, loss, and the weight of a truth so heavy it nearly crushed the man left behind. 4 years ago, just before the pandemic turned the world upside down, a man named Caleb lost his wife, Evelyn. They were both 29 at the time, living in a quiet suburb just outside of Denver. Evelyn was struck by a car. Someone lost control, swerved into her lane, and killed her instantly. No time for goodbye, no final words, just gone. Their marriage hadn't been in a good place for a while. Caleb says Evelyn had grown distant, secretive. She was constantly on edge about her phone, always clutching it close, never letting it out of her sight. At the time, he thought it was just a rough patch, but after her death, the truth began to unfold, and it unraveled everything he thought he knew about her. It started with a routine checkup. Caleb found out he had contracted an STD. The doctor's words barely registered in his mind until it all clicked. Evelyn had cheated on him. It wasn't just a suspicion, it was fact. And then came the confirmation that broke him. While sorting through her belongings, Caleb remembered that they'd often exchanged phone passwords. She had never changed hers. So, in a daze, he accessed her phone and her old laptop, praying it was some kind of mistake. But it wasn't. The most recent messages were still there, ones she never had a chance to delete. A man Caleb vaguely remembered from college, someone he thought was just an acquaintance, had sent her a message the day she died. He was asking for explicit photos from their last hookup. The tone, the familiarity, the casualness. It was clear this wasn't a one-time affair. It had been ongoing. Caleb kept searching, driven by a need to understand. On her work laptop, hidden deep inside a subfolder labeled Payroll Archives, he found an encrypted file. He cracked it open, and what he saw tore his heart in half. Photos. Dozens of them. Of Evelyn with this man, of Evelyn with others. One photo stood out. She had short hair in it, a style she only wore briefly after their engagement. That meant she had been with this man for at least 3 of the 6 years they'd been together. And that was only the one he recognized. There were photos of 2 other men as well. Strangers, no names, no messages, just images, evidence of a life he hadn't known she was living. Stunned and sickened, Caleb reached out to the man in the photos. He calmly told him that he knew. He even mentioned the STD. But Caleb wasn't looking for revenge. He just asked him to keep it quiet, to let her family remember her the way they wanted to. Kind, generous, devoted. The man agreed, said only his ex knew, and promised to handle it. Caleb decided then and there to carry the burden alone. He chose silence, convinced that sparing her parents and siblings from the truth was the right thing to do. Evelyn's family adored her, especially her older brother Daniel, now 39, who had always treated Caleb like a brother. 2 years after Evelyn's death, Caleb felt ready to open his heart again. Daniel noticed and gently encouraged Caleb to meet someone new. He introduced Caleb to his sister-in-law, Leela, who was 30 at the time. She and Caleb had only met a few times before, in passing, but there was something about her, warmth, understanding, calm. Their connection was immediate. Just 3 months into dating, they were already exchanging I love yous. A year and a half later, they were engaged. For the first time in a long time, Caleb felt light again, hopeful, safe. Eventually, Caleb shared the truth about Evelyn with Leela. He even showed her the files. She wept, not just for him, but for the betrayal, for the years he had lost. She held him through it, and he thought that was the end of that chapter. But it wasn't. Evelyn's family, especially her mother and younger sister, Madison, kept pulling him back into a role he no longer fit. Every gathering became a shrine to Evelyn. Conversations would drift to memories. "You remember how she used to dance in the kitchen, right, Caleb?" Or, "She always said you made the best pancakes, didn't she?" He played along at first. Said he wasn't ready to talk. Said it was still too raw. That worked for a while. But once he started seeing Leela, the expectations grew heavier. They wanted grief. They wanted reverence. They wanted the illusion. And Caleb couldn't breathe under it anymore. Caleb always felt like he had to walk on glass around Evelyn's mother and younger sister. Every word, every glance, every silence was weighed and measured. If he didn't mention Evelyn when they reminisced, he was met with cold stares. If he didn't speak about her with reverence, they would quietly scold him with narrowed eyes or a disapproving tone. One time, in a moment of bitterness, Madison even said aloud that it was clear Caleb never really loved Evelyn. She apologized right after, but the words stuck like thorns. The truth was, she wasn't entirely wrong. By the time Evelyn died, Caleb's love for her had withered into something hollow. What remained was obligation and habit. And now, years later, he felt no hatred, just exhaustion. He was tired of carrying the memory of a woman who had betrayed him, and worse, having to dress that memory as something beautiful for the sake of everyone else. There were still moments he caught himself wishing she were alive, not because he missed her, but because he wished he didn't have to pretend anymore. Pretend she was loyal, pretend she was loving, pretend their story was something worth preserving. Evelyn's friends still invited him to her birthday reunions. He always went, even though he knew at least one of her affair partners would likely be there. He went not for her, but for them, because so many of them truly loved her. Because to them, Evelyn was more than her mistakes. She was light, and he didn't have the heart to rob them of that. But the strain of this double life was beginning to unravel him. And worse, it was hurting Leela. He couldn't hold Leela's hand at family events. He couldn't kiss her forehead. He couldn't even look at her the way he wanted to. Not without triggering a ripple of discomfort through Evelyn's mother and Madison. Even Evelyn's best friend, who had once been close with Leela, stopped speaking to her entirely. Like loving Caleb meant betraying Evelyn's ghost. At Thomas's birthday party the week before, it all came to a head. Leela and Caleb had gotten up to dance. Just one song. A quiet moment of joy in the middle of everything. But Evelyn's mother had walked over and asked them to stop dancing. "Please," she whispered, "just for tonight. It's too hard. You have to respect my grief." A few days later, she contacted Caleb's mother and even Leela's parents. She told her she was disappointed. Disappointed that he had proposed to Leela so soon. 4 years. 4 years had passed. And still, it wasn't enough. It was in that moment that Caleb realized he couldn't keep doing this. His love for Leela was real. It was warm and true and safe, but he couldn't live a life where their happiness had to hide in the shadows of someone who hadn't even honored their marriage. And so, for the first time, he started wondering, what if he told the truth? Would he be cruel for telling them that Evelyn had cheated? That the woman they mourned had been living a double life for at least 3 years? Some people would say yes, but others might say it was time. Still, Caleb wasn't sure he could bring himself to tell Evelyn's whole family. It would devastate them. That's not what he wanted. But maybe he could tell Thomas. Thomas was more than just a friend now. He was family in every way that mattered. He had introduced Caleb to Leela, he had stood by them both, and he deserved to know the truth, even if it hurt. Caleb thought of the conversation they might have. He imagined sitting across from Thomas, holding a mug of coffee with trembling hands, and saying something like, "You know how much your family means to me. I've done everything I could to honor Evelyn's memory, but the truth is, I've been carrying something heavy, and I didn't want to say anything because it wouldn't bring her back. But now it's hurting Leela, it's hurting me, and I don't know how much longer I can pretend." He wouldn't have to show the photos, not unless Thomas asked. He could simply say that before Evelyn died, things had gotten bad, that she had been unfaithful, that he chose not to tell anyone because he thought it was the right thing to do. But now that silence was becoming a prison. Caleb didn't want to hurt Thomas. He just wanted to breathe. If Thomas knew, maybe he could help. Maybe he could talk to their mother and to Madison, and maybe Caleb and Leela could finally show up to a family gathering and not feel like trespassers in someone else's shrine. He didn't know what would happen next, but he was ready to tell the truth. Caleb had reached his breaking point. The pressure of pretending, of being Evelyn's grieving husband instead of the man she'd betrayed, had twisted into something unbearable. And now that he was trying to build a future with Leela, that grief he had been forced to wear like a mask was poisoning the life they were trying to create together. He needed help. He needed someone he trusted, so he turned to Thomas. There was no confrontation, no outburst. Just a quiet conversation that started with a trembling voice and tired eyes. Caleb told Thomas how much he valued him, how deeply he respected their bond and his family. He said he didn't want to speak ill of the dead. He never had. But the weight of Evelyn's memory, twisted and beautified by those who never saw what was happening behind closed doors, was slowly destroying his present. I don't want to hurt anyone, but I have to protect what I have now. I have to protect Leela. This shadow Evelyn left behind, it's seeping into every part of my life. I'm begging you, as my brother and my friend, how do I move forward without tearing this family apart? He didn't want to make it a public reckoning. He didn't want to tarnish every photo on their mantle. But maybe Thomas could help. Maybe he could speak to their mother and to Madison and explain why Caleb could no longer play the grieving widower, why he couldn't let the memory of a marriage that had been broken long before the accident dictate how he was allowed to love again. Thomas listened. That's all Caleb needed for now. Weeks passed before Caleb returned with an update. The silence had been necessary. Too many people had reached out after he first shared his story, some with advice, others with judgment. But Caleb wasn't looking for validation. He was trying to survive. This time, though, he wanted to offer clarity, because there had been something left unsaid, something he hadn't shared in the beginning, out of guilt or shame, or maybe a bit of both. "I know people are quick to paint Evelyn as a villain," he wrote. "And maybe in some ways she was a terrible wife, but she wasn't a terrible person." He meant it. Evelyn had loved him, maybe not in the way he needed, but in the only way she knew how. He had seen the messages she sent to her friends, the way she spoke about him with pride and affection. She had worried that he would leave her. She had been afraid. She had even asked people for advice on how to fix their marriage. Caleb remembered reading one message where she said, "I just want him to look at me the way he used to." But Evelyn had also been selfish. She had a sex kink, one Caleb couldn't accept. She'd brought it up twice, once early in their relationship and again after their wedding. Both times he shut it down completely. It made him uncomfortable, and he had made no effort to hide his disapproval. In hindsight, maybe he had been too harsh, too dismissive, but it wasn't something he could bring himself to entertain. That need, that hunger she carried in secret, eventually pulled her into the arms of other men. The images he found, the ones tucked away in her laptop, weren't just random encounters. They were tied directly to that kink. She was acting on something she couldn't share with her husband, and while it didn't excuse the betrayal, it explained something about her that Caleb hadn't understood until it was too late. She had hurt him deeply, but she hadn't set out to. She had been reckless and cowardly, not malicious. There was a difference. She was a terrible partner, he admitted, but not a terrible soul. That's why people loved her. That's why this is so hard. Still, he had made his decision. Caleb and Lila went to Thomas and Monica's house. It was time to speak the truth. He explained everything, not just the affairs, but how pretending had eaten away at his joy, how he couldn't bear to be treated like Evelyn's monument anymore, how no matter how much he tried to stay quiet for the sake of her family, he was drowning in the weight of it all. "I didn't love who she became," he said. "We were heading for a divorce. Even if I never found the pictures, even if she never died, we weren't going to last." The only reason he hadn't spoken sooner was because it felt cruel to destroy the image they all cherished. But that silence had begun to rot everything around him. He had no choice but to speak. Because sometimes honoring the dead means being honest about the pain they left behind. Caleb had never wanted to hurt anyone. That is why he kept Evelyn's secret. Even after the betrayal, even after the shame, he convinced himself that silence was the kindest gift he could give to her memory, and to those who still clung to it. But the cost of that silence was becoming unbearable. Pretending she was perfect meant erasing what had nearly broken him. It meant carrying the weight of lies so others could feel peace. That night at Thomas and Monica's house, something shifted. Caleb told them the truth, but gently, cautiously, allowing them the choice to ask for more or to stop right there. Thomas didn't hesitate. He wanted to know everything. Caleb warned him. He said the proof was graphic, deeply personal, disturbing even. But Thomas was firm. If Caleb had carried this alone for years, then Thomas could at least carry part of it with him now. Even so, Caleb didn't want to show the photos directly to Thomas. It didn't feel right. So instead, Thomas asked Monica to see them. Caleb opened the folder and stepped away. Monica's reaction said it all. She barely got through a few images before recoiling, visibly shaken. She turned to her husband and quietly confirmed what Caleb had already said. It was real, and it was worse than they'd imagined. Thomas sat in silence for a few long seconds. Then came the storm. "Why was she so stupid?" he muttered, voice tight. "Why would she do this?" He didn't say it with hate. It was frustration, sorrow. A grieving brother realizing that the person he had put on a pedestal was in the end just human and deeply flawed. He cursed a few more times. Never at Caleb, just at everything. The betrayal, the loss, the deception Evelyn left behind. Then, without another word, he stood up and walked out of the room. Caleb slipped away quietly, leaving Lila and Monica talking. He drove through the empty streets of Denver, trying to calm the noise inside his chest. Guilt crept in again. Had he done the right thing? Had he just destroyed a family's memory of someone they loved? An hour later, his phone buzzed. Thomas. He said, "Come back." Caleb returned to find the front door open. Monica was crying softly, and Thomas met him at the entrance with a quiet embrace. No words at first, just the kind of hug that said everything words couldn't. They sat down again. "What do you want to do now?" Thomas asked. Caleb didn't hesitate. I just want to move on. I want to be happy with Lila. I don't want to be stuck in this ghost story anymore." Thomas nodded slowly. "I'll take care of it. I'll talk to Mom and Madison. You don't have to do anything else. Just give it some space. Distance yourself from them for a while. Evelyn's friends, too." He paused. "You're my brother, Caleb. That's never going to change." They all hugged again. Something in Caleb's chest eased for the first time in years. A few days later, Madison reached out. Caleb hadn't expected that. She admitted something he wasn't prepared to hear. She had known, at least partially. A year before Evelyn died, Evelyn had confided in her, said she had cheated, but planned to come clean, to fix the marriage. She believed her. She thought Caleb and Evelyn were trying to work through it. She apologized, repeatedly. "I've been pretending she was flawless since the day she died," she wrote. "It wasn't healthy, for me or for Mom. Maybe it's time we stopped." She offered her help if Caleb ever needed it. As for Evelyn's parents, though, they remained in the dark. Caleb, Thomas, and Monica agreed it would be best that way. Her father, quiet and thoughtful, remained kind to Caleb, still inviting him out to talk about work, still calling him son. Caleb planned to keep those moments, to make time to see him when possible. Funny enough, his future father-in-law and Evelyn's father had struck up a friendship too. Caleb and Thomas joked about taking both dads fishing or golfing or just out for a drink once a month. It was bittersweet, but it was good. Caleb's relationship with Evelyn's mother, though, stayed distant. He didn't hate her, but he couldn't be what she wanted him to be anymore. And he wouldn't let her grief guilt him into pretending. In the middle of all this, Lila brought something up. She didn't want to wait anymore. They had talked about a long engagement, giving everyone space, letting time pass. But now, after everything, they both realized there was no point in waiting. They wanted to start their life. They were planning for March, or maybe April. Spring, when things bloom again. A quiet ceremony. No ghosts. Caleb was ready. Finally. And more than anything, he was happy. Sometimes, Caleb found himself drifting through ordinary moments in life with a strange detachment. A casual phrase like "pillar of the community" would make his chest tighten. The simple mention of a bread knife could stir a sudden memory, one he didn't want. Even seeing someone water their garden in the quiet of a Sunday morning could twist something in him. Evelyn used to love the garden. She'd insist they keep it perfect, as if a blooming yard could patch over the fractures inside their home. It was moments like those that reminded Caleb how grief could seep into everything, even years later. Not just grief over her death, but grief over the life he thought he had and the love he thought was real. Still, as much pain as he'd carried, he had managed to find his footing again. The truth was out, at least with the people who mattered most. Thomas knew, Monica knew. Even Madison had finally acknowledged Evelyn's flaws. For the first time in a long time, Caleb didn't feel like he was pretending. And more than that, he felt like he had someone truly on his side. Thomas had shown up for him in a way that Caleb didn't think was possible. After hearing everything, the photos, the betrayal, the secrets, he hadn't turned away. He hadn't tried to defend Evelyn or minimize Caleb's pain. Instead, he stepped up, took control of the difficult conversations Caleb had dreaded for years, and told him with no hesitation, "You're my brother. That won't ever change." There was a quiet relief in knowing that. Caleb still kept his distance from Evelyn's mother and from her old circle of friends, not out of malice, just self-preservation. He couldn't keep being the stand-in for someone's fantasy version of Evelyn. He couldn't sit at a table full of people who would always see him as her grieving husband instead of the man she betrayed. Some relationships, he'd realized, are better left with boundaries. The only connection he kept was with her father, a gentleman, never one to push or pry. Their conversations usually drifted toward work or baseball or old fishing stories. Caleb treasured those moments. They reminded him that not everything had to be complicated. Not every tie had to hurt. Oddly enough, Evelyn's father and Leela's father had become close too. Caleb and Thomas talked about setting up regular outings with both of them, maybe a quiet lake trip, or just some beers and laughter at a local bar. It was strange how life could bring people together, even in the wreckage of old wounds. And through it all, Leela had remained steady, loving, patient. She knew the full truth now, every painful piece of it, and she still chose him. That meant everything. They had originally talked about waiting a while to get married, maybe a long engagement, just to let time soften the rough edges. But now, they both agreed, there was no point in waiting anymore. Too much had already been wasted in silence and regret. Spring felt like a fresh beginning, maybe March, maybe April, but definitely soon. Caleb didn't want a grand celebration. He didn't want 1,000 eyes on him or speeches about new beginnings. He just wanted a quiet day with the people who had walked beside him through the darkest parts of his life. He wanted to hold Leela's hands and finally feel like the future wasn't something he had to tiptoe around. He was ready. It wasn't a perfect ending. The past still lingered. Sometimes he still dreamed of Evelyn, not as she was in those final years, but the version of her he'd loved in the beginning. The one who danced in their kitchen barefoot and laughed until her nose crinkled. That version didn't exist anymore. Maybe she never had, but the memory still hurt. Still, he had survived it. He had carried it alone for so long, and now he didn't have to anymore. There would always be echoes, phrases that stung, objects that reminded him of what he lost. But for the first time, those echoes didn't drown him. They simply passed through. He had Leela. He had a new story to build, one not anchored in grief, but in honesty and love. And even though some scars would never fade completely, Caleb had learned how to live around them. And in the quiet moments of his new life, he finally felt something he never thought he would again. Peace. Caleb never imagined that healing would come with so many layers of grief. Grief for a wife he once loved. Grief for a life he thought they shared. Grief for the years lost pretending everything was fine. But now, standing beside Leela, planning their quiet spring wedding in the foothills outside Denver, he finally saw a future that didn't hurt to imagine. Not every scar fades, and not every answer brings peace. But Caleb had chosen to stop carrying someone else's lie, and in doing so, he found something worth holding on to. His truth. Stories like Caleb's aren't rare. Many people stay silent about betrayal because they're afraid of how the truth will affect others. But carrying someone else's secret can erode your sense of self. If you're in a toxic relationship or recovering from one, know this: your healing matters more than protecting a false image of the past. If your partner controls your access to their devices, guards their privacy excessively while demanding yours, or blames you for their dissatisfaction without honest communication, those are red flags worth examining. It's okay to ask questions. It's okay to say no. And it's okay to leave. If you're recovering from emotional trauma, surround yourself with people who listen without judgment. Choose honesty, even when it's painful, because pretending for others only prolongs your own suffering. Setting boundaries, even with people who love you, isn't cruel. It's self-preservation. Above all, give yourself permission to rebuild. You are not the mistakes of your past relationship. You are not the secrets someone forced you to keep. You are someone who survived, and that alone is a kind of courage the world desperately needs more of.